Welcome to Leading with Empathy and Allyship. I'm Melinda Briana Epler, the founder and CEO of Change Catalyst and your host. At Leading with Empathy and Allyship, we have deep, real conversations about how we can be more inclusive leaders in our workplaces and our communities. And this is a safe space to learn, to build empathy for each other, to understand tangible actions that we can all take to create change. So with me today is Tammy Cho, co-founder and CEO at Hate is a Virus and BetterBrave. And we'll be talking today about how we can collectively address anti-Asian hate. Welcome, Tammy. Hey.
Hi, thanks so much for having me here.
Yeah, really glad you're here. Glad that we've reconnected and you've spoken at our Tech Inclusion conferences in the past, and I always appreciate you and all the work that you do. So a few quick notes and then we'll dive in. So again, many thanks to App Dynamics for sponsoring the show. On screen are ASL interpreters for today, and they are sponsored by Interpreter Now. This is being live captioned by White Coat Captioning, Maggie at White Coat Captioning. So if you want to turn on the captions, just go down to the bottom of your screen, click caption. You might have to click on the dots if your screen is minimized. So, but you should be able to find captions there. You can change them, change the size and such there too. Our team, Juliet, Renzo, Sally, Araya, Emily, Darlene, are all on here and are in the chat, monitoring the chat. But of course, you all know, just be inclusive in your conversations, and please do have conversations. Please share what you're learning, what's resonating for you. And if you have specific questions you want us to address, just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen so we can find those easily. And we'll spend some time toward the end to really dive into those questions. So. Excellent. Well, and hello to Linda, Pamela, Amy, Michelle, Francisca, and Serena. Thank you for introducing yourselves, and good to see you, Sherry. Today, we're talking about an important topic. There's been a rise of anti-Asian violence, microaggressions, and overall hate since the pandemic began. And we actually started off Leading with Empathy and Allyship. Our very first episode was addressing xenophobia with Michelle Kim, because already it had started back in April of 2020. So this is the next stage of that conversation. Hate crimes targeting Asian Americans have spiked 150% in major cities in the US. And today we're going to talk about what we can do about that, whether we're from the AAPI community or we are allies. So let's dive into that conversation. First, Tammy, can you just tell us a bit about your story and kind of how you came to be doing the work that you do?
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Tammy, and you know, where it started for me in terms of this work in particular, earlier last year, right around March, when the pandemic happened and we were starting to see more of the xenophobic rhetoric being tossed around by folks in power. You know, we were seeing a huge spike in terms of the hate crimes against our community. And for me, that really hit close to home, because on one end, you know, growing up in Orange County, California, my parents were immigrants from Korea, and they had small businesses, and they, you know, had a liquor store at one time, and one of their latest businesses was running a small dry cleaning and alterations business in Orange County. And you know, day after day, I saw them go to work and working around the clock just to be able to provide for our family. Yet at the same time, I was also witness to a lot of different racist incidents that they were experiencing, even pre-pandemic. And, you know, folks calling my parents' dry cleaning business a sweatshop, or teasing them for not being able to speak English very fluently. And so when I was starting to see these news articles and conversations from friends, and I was experiencing it myself actually, and seeing that so many of the people that were targeted were folks like my parents, some of the most vulnerable people in our community, as well as really young kids, right? They were 5, 6, 7-year-olds getting bullied in school as well. I really just felt compelled to do something about it. And that's when I came across my co-founder, Michelle Hanabusa's Instagram post, actually. And she had shared that she was also, she was very open and vulnerable about how heartbroken she too was seeing all of these different incidents and hate crimes and wanting to do something about it. Sent her a direct message, and we jumped on a phone call, all digital, and we talked about what were some of the first steps that we could take to be a part of changing this narrative and figuring out a way that we can help address these issues. And the first step really seemed to be that we could help drive awareness, because we were having some initial conversations within our own community, but we weren't seeing much conversation beyond, especially in mainstream media. So the very first step that we took was to launch a national awareness campaign using hashtag #HateIsAVirus. And it started with a few members of our community posting on social media about their experiences dealing with this racism and what this issue meant to them. And pretty soon that ended up catching fire, and other folks started to amplify and spread the message and share their stories. And soon we had thousands of people across the nation posting about this. And we are, and the campaign itself had made over 12 million impressions within the first few weeks. And there was increased national coverage as well on these issues, not just of our campaign, but other campaigns that have also had also sparked due to this. And you know, as we were starting to hear, as the movement started to spread, we were also hearing from our community in terms of all the different types of questions that they had, fears about speaking up, resources that they were looking for, and the question of, now that we know this is happening, what can we actually do? And that is, you know, that feedback is actually what really helped shape the programs and marked the next milestone for us to become a nonprofit where we can create different programs to better serve our community.
Awesome. Awesome. Cool. Do you want to just talk about a couple of the things that you offer, just so everybody knows how they can use it as a resource?
Absolutely. So yeah, and so for Hate is a Virus, we're a nonprofit community of mobilizers and amplifiers to dismantle racism and hate. And a few of the core areas that we really focus on is, one, continuing to drive both local and national awareness of these issues and make sure that the conversation is continuing to happen, because this is a problem that has existed for so long and it's not going to go away anytime soon. The second core piece that we're focused on is really about the educational aspect. We recognize that it's not enough just to raise awareness of these issues, but we also really need to understand why these issues are happening and those root causes. And so we use different educational mediums, whether and more digital, especially in this shelter-in-place environment, mediums to be able to spread context about why these issues are happening according to history, as well as contextualizing that history to current events. And you can find a lot of those resources through Instagram, Facebook, Clubhouse, TikTok, a lot of these newer platforms as well. And the last pillar that we have is really focused on what we think is one of the most important pieces of this movement, which is partnering with other community organizations and activists. And the way we do that is to really learn about the initiatives that they are working on, the different types of action steps they need from the community, and finding ways to amplify that message. Because again, you know, folks have been doing this work for so long, and we want to be able to make sure that we recognize that and amplify that work. And then the second part to that is, we also recognize that there is not enough funding to go around to a lot of these organizations. You know, and a lot of these organizations are small, grassroots, volunteer-based organizations that are really understand their local community and are building out efforts to serve them. but don't necessarily have the bandwidth to apply for really complicated grants or run marketing and crowdfunding campaigns to raise funds for their organization. And so that we recently launched another initiative called the Community Action Fund, where we are raising $1 million to be able to give back to these local community organizations that need more rapid response support.
Awesome. Awesome. Let's talk a little bit about the historical context of this, because I think it's important. You know, there is a rise in anti-Asian violence right now. It has increased, but it's also important to recognize this is not the first time. It's not new. That, you know, back in World War II, Japanese Americans were interned and there was wide violence and hate. Before that, Chinese Americans faced discrimination and violence. And, you know, in the Vietnam War, even, you know, going back to the bubonic plague in 1900 in San Francisco, Chinese Americans were persecuted and quarantined. And then, of course, in your hometown and the LA riots. And I've been thinking a lot about Spike Lee and Do the Right Thing lately, and just kind of how we're still living out so much that was going on in that movie in the 80s. So do you want to talk a little bit about his story behind this?
Sure. Yeah. You know, I think that there definitely needs to be a longer conversation to really unpack all of the historical context and how it impacts the issues that we're seeing today. But, you know, in terms, you touched on a lot of the key events in history, right? In terms of the internment camps and, you know, Chinese Americans were experienced one of the largest lynchings in our nation as well, early on. I think another key conversation that we've been having more about, and we've been seeing more conversation around, is the model minority myth, and how that the stereotype that the Asian American community is, even if they're a part of a marginalized group, are able to overcome and succeed in the world. That is actually one of the ways that one of the ideas that have been used to drive a wedge between different minority groups. And in addition to—
Tammy, can you just like take a moment to really define the model minority myth, what that means?
Sure. Yeah, so the model minority myth is this idea that was created to essentially position the Asian American community as the model minority. So, and it was used as a way to position them as, you know, despite them being a smaller group in this nation, they are able to overcome hardships by putting their heads down and working hard, and are able to succeed in this nation. And oftentimes that was an idea that was used to compare Asian Americans to other groups of color that might not be advancing as much in the nation. And the reality is that that is not true in so many levels, right? For one, even within the API community, it also leads to this perception that we're a monolith, when in reality there are so many different ethnicities and cultures within our own community. And it is dangerous as well, because there has been a report that was actually published from the Center of American Progress, and it outlines even the wage gap among AAPI women. And, you know, it already is significantly lower, but there are certain groups, such as Burmese women, who have much lower, have much wider pay gap, even compared to Korean women, for instance. And so it's so important for us to be able to recognize that there is so many flaws with this myth, and there are so many perceptions that we need to be able to address, again, through having continued education and continued dialogue around these issues.
Yeah. So let's talk about solutions. So one, I think as you and I have discussed this in the past, that there's kind of two pieces to this. One is, what can you do if you're from the AAPI community? And you know what, I realized we didn't define what is AAPI first. Let's start there, just for anybody who doesn't know, who's listening.
Sure. AAPI stands for Asian American Pacific Islander.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So let's talk about that first. If you're from the AAPI community, what can you do?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we've been hearing it a lot. And you know, I will share some action items that we can take. But also caveating that, as there are still more discussions to be had in terms of more action steps that we need to define and be able to take. But you know, one of the first things that I want to encourage our community to do is you know, take some space and time to really reflect on what's going on. I think it has been a very emotional journey just to unpack a lot of these hate crimes that we're seeing. And it's been a huge reality check and a moment of reckoning, I think, for many in our community as well, who weren't as familiar that these incidents have been occurring pre-pandemic and have just heightened through the pandemic. And so it is important to just take some time to start with yourself, do some reflection, and if you feel comfortable, reaching out to some close trusted friends and family to start having these conversations and see how different folks are unpacking this information as well. I think the second piece that I would want to encourage folks is then also to, again, understand some of the context for why this is happening. And especially, I think that's important during this time where we're seeing a lot of different reactions. You know, I think especially with a lot of, with the rise of social media, it is easier for folks to jump in and propose potential action steps to take. But I think it will be important for folks to be able to understand the context for how these actions may impact not just our own AAPI community, but other communities of color as well. And part of the way to do that, it can seem intimidating, but one of the first steps that folks can take is by reaching out to their local community organizations, learning more about the work that they've been doing in this space, and looking to these activists and organizers to learn more about what type of action steps that they propose and amplifying those messages. And a few of the folks, I know you brought in Michelle Kim early on, but she's one of a great voice to tune into and amplify. Other activists are Kathy Masaoka, Helen Zia as well, just to learn about all the different ways that they're engaging with the community. And yes.
Go ahead. I think you were probably going to go here next, but I think that the other piece is self-protection, right? Is protecting yourself physically, and I think also emotionally, spiritually, that healing piece as well.
Absolutely. And I think for folks that do feel comfortable as well, being able to share their stories with others just is incredibly powerful, because especially we saw this, especially during the height of the pandemic last year, where when folks shared their experiences, there was a level of gaslighting or their experiences being minimized by other folks in the community. And I do want to, I do think that's important to talk about, that is something that we do experience when we share these stories. But the more that we are sharing these stories regardless and being able to speak up about it is so incredibly powerful. And we're seeing that because folks have been sharing their stories so much over the past year that now, this has been a huge milestone where folks are actually starting to listen and take a second to say, oh, actually, I guess this community is really experiencing racism.
Right.
Yeah, and so just want to encourage the community, even if it can be discouraging at times to hear the responses, that their truth is still powerful, and to continue to speak up about their experiences.
Yeah, storytelling, I think, is such a key piece of allyship and building empathy. And it's it's unfortunate because it also puts the burden on the people that have gone through and experienced hate, have experienced violence, have experienced harm. And at the same time, that is telling those stories can, like you said, it can help us heal, and also it can bring us closer together and bring allies into the forefront, into the conversation and into the action. Yeah, that's a really good point. There's other organizations out there too that have workshops, and I attended a session last week from the Center for Anti-Violence Education. They're doing a series of workshops right now on how to be an upstander for allies, and also how to protect yourself if you're from the AAPI community. So we can list some more resources on our website following the episode too. Let's go into what allies can do. What can allies do to really make a difference and stand up and be there for the AAPI community right now?
Yeah, that's also a great question. For the allies that are out there, I think one, touching on the last point that I shared as well, is just being a listening ear to the community, checking in with them to see, how they're feeling, how they're processing the incidents that are going on. I think is really helpful, again, because there is this tendency for our community to, when we do speak up, to feel gaslit for our experiences, or for our experiences to be downplayed. I think the second piece, again, is similarly the education piece. I can't emphasize that enough, where it's so important for us to continue to have dialogue around, learn about the historical context, learn about, why these issues are continuing to happen, what the root causes of those are, and what type of solutions are being in the works by different community organizations and organizers. And again, stressing that when we're exploring these solutions, making sure that we're taking an intersectional lens and seeing how these are impacting different communities is incredibly important. And then the other action item that I would encourage folks to take on is finding ways to, again, amplify the different leaders and also just amplifying the issues in itself as well. We don't, this movement won't go anywhere if it's an echo chamber of just the AAPI community talking amongst ourselves about the experiences that we have. We really need the allies to step in and really share our stories and continue to drive conversations with other folks as well. I think another incredibly important action step and powerful action step too is being able to bring these conversations, depending on where your industry is, where you're working. There is an opportunity to raise this to leadership as well, right? So whether if you work for a company, being able to talk to your senior leaders to share, I sense that these issues are going on. How can we create a discussion around this? How can we mobilize our community, our employees, to be able to do something about this? If you're in politics or in media, also doing the same with your leadership and encouraging folks to continue covering these stories and talking about these stories long after it's covered in the media as well.
Yeah, and something I don't think you just mentioned that you touched on earlier is that there's a lot of organizations that are working to create change and are underfunded. And so individually and also our workplaces, I think, have the opportunity to really help fund those organizations and help create change that way too.
Yeah, I love that point, Melinda. One thing I would add to that too, and encourage folks who are listening in, is even if you could do a little bit of the homework of just looking at local community organizations, especially just because they're oftentimes the one who are closest to the community and really, really understand the nuances of each community. Because if you think about it, the AAPI community, for instance, in Los Angeles, and the type of resources that they receive look very different from the AAPI community in the South or in the Midwest. And so it's so important what these local community organizations are doing. So if you can take some time to find those different organizations and groups and be able to fund them, donate to them, that would be incredibly powerful.
Awesome. And let's talk a little bit about being an upstander and versus, bystander, and what you can do in the moment, because there are definitely opportunities when we see something to do something. Any thoughts, any thoughts around that?
Yes, another great question. So, one of our past collaborators is Hollaback. They're another organization that creates incredible resources as to what you can do if you're experiencing or if you witness harassment on the streets. They include some strategies as to one of the examples is if you are in a situation, you're witnessing somebody yelling at a person on the bus for being Asian and for causing the coronavirus, for instance, one of the strategies could be to, if you feel safe, just walking up to the person who is being attacked and just having a separate conversation with them. Just completely ignore the perpetrator and pretend like you're not, you're in a different bubble, in a different world with this individual until they go away. And so I would really recommend looking at those guides. They also host a series of workshops. Organization Melinda also mentioned hosts a series of workshops as well. So those are all great places to start. The other action step that I would really encourage folks is to report. Reporting there has been over a 1900% increase in terms of reports of these hate crimes in the past year, according to Stop API Hate, a group that also launched to better collect and identify these reports. I think something to also remember is that there's still a major issue with reporting. In terms of underreporting. So folks oftentimes feel intimidated to report for a variety of reasons, whether it's just general confusion about the process, not knowing where to report, but also hesitancy to report if it's related to law enforcement, for instance. I think we do need to bring some more clarity and provide some of these safer reporting channels for folks and be able to communicate with them. Stop API Hate is definitely one of those platforms that folks can turn to, and really encourage folks, whether you experienced racism or you've witnessed it, to report to these channels, because ultimately this data will help us better understand the different spectrum of incidents that occur, how to respond to those incidents, as well as it has the power to impact policy changes to better protect our communities as well.
Awesome. And Michelle, thank you for sharing that link in the chat. We'll also put that in our list of resources that we put on our website when we release the podcast next week. So you can go to our website to see those resources as well, and all the resources that we're listing here. And I want to open it up to questions soon. So if y'all have questions, I see some coming in. If y'all have questions, please put them in the Q&A down at the bottom of the screen so we can find those easily. And we'll leave lots of time for questions. A difficult discussion we kind of touched on earlier is that the issue extends beyond white against Asian violence right now, and it has for some time, and to other communities as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I know that's something that you're thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely, as we mentioned, racism is not new and it's really complicated. Otherwise, it would have been addressed. And it definitely is an ongoing conversation that we're having, and really want to encourage folks to continue to find different ways to learn from different community leaders, organizers, and activists around these issues. Something that we're really focused on and talking about as a community as well with our community is learning more about coming together to have more conversations across different communities of color to better understand the different solutions that they're exploring, the different challenges that they're experiencing, just so we have more understanding in terms of how we can work together to combat white supremacy and these structures that perpetuate racism. And so that has been a really core component, that core area that we're focused on. And as much as racism is not new, I also do want to highlight that activism is not necessarily new. And there has been such an incredible history of solidarity among communities of color as well. And unfortunately, part of it is just that it's not covered in our history books. And there is not as much dialogue or amplification of these moments. And so I really want to, whether it's with Martin Luther King Jr. and his activism for the API community, or Grace Lee Boggs advocating for the Black community, there are so many of these moments of history that we can turn back to that have set the foundation for where we are today. And so finding hope in those moments of solidarity and using that as a foundation to find more ways to collaborate, listen to each other, and compassionately work together, I think will be really, really important. And we're still seeing these initiatives today as well, where, for instance, one of the groups that had started recently in response to the hate crimes has been Compassion in Oakland. It's started by Latino activist Jacob Acevedo, and there's hundreds. It's a multiracial coalition of hundreds of volunteers who safely escort elderly Asian citizens who might be impacted on the streets. And so they'll guide them back home. And so really grateful to see the progress that's being made. We still have a very long way to go, and there's still so much work to be done, but just trusting that there's progress being made as well.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think a part of allyship for all of us is to really go back to our communities, talk to our communities, amplify, and also build understanding, build empathy, build trust, and solidarity with each other. I'm going to jump to a couple of questions. I know Linda just left, but she has a good question here. It's a long one. What do you think we need to do to empower AAPI folks, maybe first and second generation, to speak up and speak out? And she gives context. My concern working at a federal civil rights agency, she works at the EEOC, is that people choose not to report discrimination, harassment. And I totally understand and respect people needing to make choices about how they can best survive incidences by brushing them off, taking time to heal. I think my job in partnership with you all in the community is how can we empower people to feel that reporting problems are a viable tool in their toolbox. What can we do to make people feel more confident to come forward?
That's such a great question. And I think it's important for us to talk about, especially with the severe lack of reporting that the community is currently experiencing. I think for one of the steps that we can take is to address some of the fears, really understand why people are scared of reporting, and be able to provide some more context and address some of those fears, right? And I think a couple of the ones that we've heard typically surround, for instance, whether they're allowed to report if they're an immigrant, or if they're an undocumented immigrant, for instance, or there's also the question of, will this information go directly to law enforcement? And there are some tensions even within our own API community where folks, certain groups, experience higher rates of police brutality. And I think that there's a lot of questions and uncertainty around when people do report, where that information goes and who has access to that information. And so any more clarity that we can provide to the people that are reporting or looking to report, I think will help as one of the steps. And then I think the second piece, especially when it comes to communicating and reaching to the first and second generation, I think also reaching out to them and sharing this information in mediums where they're at, And I think a lot of times right now, it's digital mediums, different digital mediums will be very important to be able to connect with these individuals, but we also need, so when we need the digital engagement front, and so being on all the different channels that these people will be able to access to learn more about how to report, addressing the concerns of reporting, where to report, and we also need the local engagement as well. And we've been seeing some of these efforts in Los Angeles with LA versus Hate, for instance. They partnered with 211 and have been tabling safely outdoors in some areas just to be able to help explain to people where they can go to report incidents. And I think the other last thing I'll share on the reporting front, just as a starter thought, is being able to provide these resources in multiple languages is also essential, because as we mentioned, our community is very, very diverse and there's a lot of different languages. And we to be really able to empower our community to continue reporting, it's important for us to also translate a lot of these questions and resources into languages that they'll also be able to understand.
Yeah, awesome. And I want to point out what Sherry says in the chat too, that in workplaces and other professional settings, reporting harassment often can backfire, can actually cause you harm, or if you're not believed, or if there's retribution, etc. Especially if the harasser has more clout. And until that changes, it's hard to encourage people to report. And then she says that's why we need active bystanders, which I think is so crucial, is that it's all of us need to report. All of us need to report. And the more voices report, the more things are likely to be addressed. So it really is on all of us to make that change, to make the difference there. Okay, so another person asks, an anonymous person that asks, while white supremacy underlies the anti-Asian violence historically, how do we address the xenophobia in communities of color, for example, Black on Asian hate, violence, or speech? And we kind of started to address that a bit, but do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, that's a really a big challenge, right? And I think it will require more dialogue and conversation across communities to be able to further address this. Even within our own API community, there's a lot of anti-Blackness, and a lot of those roots can also be traced back to some of these systems of white supremacy that have created different narratives that have impacted our relationships to one another. And so I think, again, we will need to take a step back. And I think Michelle Kim also created a really incredible resource that was shared in the chat as well, where she unpacks that a little bit more, right, in terms of how different forms of how white supremacy has really driven a wedge between different communities of color, and has led to anti-Blackness within our community, and has led to these other tensions. And that is a really important first step for us to take, to really understand the context and the why the tensions exist in the first place. And then from there needs to be healing across our communities, and a space for us to talk about these issues that have impacted us for so long and has affected our perceptions of each other for so long, and then be able to then build from there. And again, those efforts are in progress, and we need more folks to get involved to continue to mend these relationships and unite as a community, because yeah, we're all in this fight against racism together.
And another question coming in: how do we proactively prevent these kinds of attacks from happening in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the key conversations that we've been learning from and hearing about in conversations with local community organizations and organizers is also being able to unpack, one step is unpacking why these incidents might be occurring, but the other piece is also, it's so essential for us to be able to continue to provide essential services to the community. a lot of these crimes as well, a part of the driving factors are economic reasons, and it points to just a lack of resources that are available to our various communities. And so in addition to the education of understanding the historical context, I think there's also just more investment that needs to be done in terms of local resources that are provided to the community, whether it's mental health support, better protections, or resources for our elderly, and being able to continue to amplify and donate to those resources.
Awesome. And that's a huge question. We could, spend hours just on that question, is how do we correct systemic racism? How do we correct the narrative and all that ends up putting into our heads around microaggressions and biases, and that can go further and go deeper into hate and violence. Yeah. Well, we have a few minutes, and I do want to recognize that you have multiple hats and you do multiple things, and you have intersectional identities, right? And I think that's part of this too. Is can you talk a little bit about what you're doing with BetterBrave and what you've been doing with BetterBrave?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for creating that space. So in addition to Hate is a Virus, I do have another nonprofit that I launched back in 2017. And that BetterBrave is a nonprofit that really focuses on empowering employees with resources on how to navigate workplace harassment and discrimination. And part of the reason I had started that organization was due to my own experiences in the tech industry and recognizing how toxic it could be. And recognizing that a lot of times we don't know the resources that are typically available to us to know how to navigate is either too expensive and inaccessible, or we have to talk to our companies about helping us resolve those issues. But sometimes there's a conflict of interest there as well. And so just being able to provide a way for folks to have free access to free resources to help them navigate these issues was something that was very important to us. So that's the other work that I'm focused on.
Awesome. And do you want to share some, because it intersects with this work, I think, in that, Sherry's comment earlier around reporting harassment. Do you want to share some of what you've learned in terms of, I think there's two pieces of it. One is giving people the tools that they need to report themselves, and then also how do we create the structures that create a safe space for reporting and really have those processes ironed out.
Yeah, I think even before stepping into the reporting piece, I think something that we do need to focus on is what the second piece that you mentioned in terms of creating a culture where people feel safe to report. And that requires a lot of building trust with the company. And some of the ways that companies can really take initiative building that trust with employees is showing that they really care about these issues, and it goes beyond a social media post and a pledge, right? Or even an internal email newsletter that says we stand by you, right? Employees will need to see tangible action steps that the companies are taking, whether it's them investing in investing in different workshops, for instance, to help us really unpack the different biases, and create space for employees to be able to freely talk about these issues, and continuing to have these conversations with them beyond API Heritage Month and beyond when this news is covered in the media. And I think once employees start to see that companies really care and are willing to put in the effort to really learn and discuss these issues, I think that will help build confidence in terms of feeling safe reporting incidents as well.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And we have some comments from guests here around psychological safety being critical, and building that psychological safety takes a lot of work and training, I think, around managers and leadership to really address psychological safety and ways to build that across teams, first and foremost across teams, then across the country across the company as well. Yeah, Sherry says employer commitment has to go well beyond just legal compliance, 100%.
Yes.
Great. Well, where can people learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, so people can learn more about hate as the virus at hateasthevirus.org and BetterBrave at betterbrave.org. Both of those websites have a different set of resources that folks can access to, whether it's learning about how to navigate these issues or other community organizations to reach out to for resources. They're all available there, and they're continuing to grow. So if folks have any requests for different types of resources they want to see or any questions, they can contact us there as well.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, again, a lot of resources we shared in this show. So if you're looking for those resources, we'll share them when the podcast comes out next week. We'll share them on our website, which is changecatalyst.co/allyship series. And so I really appreciate you, Tammy, and appreciate you spending the time to share your knowledge and wisdom in the work that you do today.
Yeah, thank you so much for creating the space for us to share a little bit of our story and some of the lessons that we've learned in this process as well.
Awesome. Awesome. All right, everybody, thank you for your questions. Appreciate you and appreciate your comments in the chat as well. It definitely helps me to understand what you're thinking, and it fuels the conversation. So appreciate you each week doing that. Join us each week, and please share this with your colleagues. You can find our previous episodes at changecatalyst.co/allyship series, and please find our episode on your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube and subscribe. That helps us, and give it a review if you're on iTunes. That helps us grow our audience. Really appreciate that. A special thanks again to App Dynamics and Interpreter Now. Sally is going to share in the chat here where you can learn more about App Dynamics and their career opportunities. And appreciate you all again, and see you next week. Thank you.